Okay. Hi, Holly.
Hey, Joe.
Hey. And
I'm excited to be here today talking to you.
yeah, same here. Same here. So lovely to see you. And maybe we should. Do you think we might start by introducing ourselves to all the folks who might be listening in?
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Hello, my name's Holly. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them, and I'm a queer femme living on the land of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. So I've been offered lots of different psychiatric labels, but I haven't found that worldview particularly helpful. And so I prefer to identify as someone with big feelings or as a highly sensitive person in an often insensitive world. I've also been a drug health service user. So I work as an expert by experience, a peer support worker in the public mental health system, and as a lived experience researcher for the University of Sydney. I guess because I'm hungry for humanistic ways to understand my experiences about like this triangle of addiction, trauma, mental health. And for me, I found lived experience perspectives most helpful in my recovery, and I want to be part of passing them on and paying them forward. How about you?
So my name is Jo River, and my pronouns are they, them. I guess I would describe myself as a conventional researcher, or maybe expert by education. That's what I bring to a team. I'm an academic at the University of Sydney and in the Faculty of Medicine and Health. And today I'm speaking from Gadigal, Wongal land of the Eora Nation. And I guess just like to acknowledge that those lands have never been ceded, and also acknowledge the ongoing resistance to colonisation. So I am a social scientist. I specialise in co-design and co-production work in the field of what people call mental health. I also do research around gender and health. And I was really fortunate to connect with Holly and also Brett Bellingham, who's a peer support worker and lived experience researcher who also co-designed this talk. And since we've met, we've been having ongoing and very rich dialogues about research and lived experience perspectives in research. And I guess I would say that both Holly and Brett, you really provoked me to think about a deeper and more involved kind of partnership in research and with people with lived experience as a matter really not only of improving services and care, but also as a matter of justice. So, yeah. I guess I'm just going to say to people who are listening in today, we see that there is a question and answer function, but we might, if you pop questions into that, it's okay, but we might just look at them at the end, more because we'll all talk about in a minute about the style that we want to present in, and maybe why we want to present in that way. But just to give you a quick narrative about why we're here, how we came to be here, why we've got this title, why we're talking today. I guess we're firstly just really happy to be here to talk to people who might be interested in ideas around co-design and co-production. And we really want to support that in the community and in services and in the academy. But our journey here really, it started when I first met Brett Bellingham, and we just discussed the concerns that we had about really meaningful engagement of people with lived experience in research, which led us to co-design a research project, which was a research, I guess a translational research project called the Consumer Research Training. And what it did was it actually supported people with lived experience to train in research methods and also gave people an opportunity to work in research teams. So from off the back of that, we actually founded something we call the Co-Production Collective. Really, it's a sort of fairly informal community of practice of lived experience and conventional researchers who want to connect and think about co-design and co-production, and also as a way for us to try and connect people with opportunities to do research. And so we were then pretty fortunate because we got some funding from the Mental Health Commission in New South Wales, and we began to formalise some of that work. So there's a broader team of people who are across health services and universities came together to do that. And we came up with a model of research partnership, which was really is designed to try to support people to do that work, because it's not like we all just know how to do it. And that project is called Raising the Bar, which you might hear us talking about, being, raising the bar on what's possible in research. And that includes, we do training for and mentorship for people with lived experience and for conventional researchers on how to collaborate and run talks like this one today. Although I have to say, this is our first very, very didactic talk. Normally, we try to have an opportunity for people to come together and have conversations about this, because we understand that it's inherently quite, it's different and also has challenges related to the broader sort of context of doing that research. We're actually now, the Raising the Bar project, I guess, is supporting multiple co-production, co-design and consumer-led research in the area of mental health, alcohol and other drugs. So we've got some projects looking at what is it for LGBTIQ A+ folks, experiences in mental health services, and what can we do about that, and as well as other projects. And so across about 4 or 5 projects, we have about 11 lived experience researchers who are employed in research teams. I think that's have to say about that. Anything I might have missed there, Holly, about our work?
No, I think that's a nice way to share a bit about the motley crew that we've been working with and what we've been getting up to.
Yeah. So I guess my hope for the talk today is that we, I guess, just to talk about our journey in terms of where we're at the moment with our understanding of co-design and co-production. Is an ever evolving for us. Constantly, we're in constant dialogue about what is it and what does it mean, and what does it mean to do it in a way that is, I guess, meaningful and thoughtful. I'd like to acknowledge the fact that I imagine there are people on this call who also have a lot of experience of thinking around co-design and co-production, so we don't want to set ourselves up as the experts, but more just to invite you into where our thinking is at, and really keen. This is a kind of a different format than we're used to, but we're really keen to have conversations with people in the community if you want to connect with us. Yeah. I don't know if you want to talk about hopes or what our style is today, Holly. Or...
Yeah, I reckon a bit the same as you. I'm hoping that we might introduce ourselves to some new folks who are out there working in similar ways or on a similar learning journey, and we might get to be partners in crime together. I think we really see language as a chance to embody our politics and our values. So I think people will hear us today avoiding clinical and biomedical language and trying to talk about things in descriptive and humanistic ways. I think, sometimes these can sound like subtle differences, for example, mental distress instead of mental illness, or drug use instead of drug abuse. But I think those differences give people a clue about our values and politics and our worldview. And I think for me, they help me enact this prefigurative politics of making things more like how I want them to be while we're working on making them how we want them to be. So I think people will also catch on that we're dialogic practitioners, also known as big fan of dialogue, and that our style is conversational, and that we're always interested in what feels important to say.
Yeah. And I guess not setting ourselves up as this is a sort of a lecture-y space, because I think co-design and co-production asks us to work in different ways. And I sort of thinking about how Kath Roper, there's a beautiful, I guess, resource that she created with Flick Gray and Emma Cadigan, which talks about, we start in unusual ways because we need to break away from the usual way of doing business, because that's the point, really, is to be in a process that is different, that is potentially disruptive. Yeah. So start the slides.
Yeah, I want to ask you some questions. Are you up for that?
Yes. That sounds fun. Hopefully it's about my side.
I guess I first want to ask you to speak a bit about what levels of engagement in research are possible.
Yeah, I guess so. This is where this picture here, this is Sherry Arnstein's ladder of engagement and citizen participation, I think she called it. You know, I was sort of having this moment today, you know, where I was thinking, why is it always a ladder? But it does seem to be, you know, I guess it speaks to us somehow, that this idea that we're sort of moving up the ladder. But I guess it also sets up an idea of hierarchy, which I don't know if we need to have it as a hierarchy so much as actually knowing where we are and being clear about where we are. So Sherry Arnstein's ladder, sort of now famous, was from the 1969s, and she was really talking about, you know, that there's these kind of places of, you know, level 1 and 2 where it's non-participation, and this is where we're really kind of doing to people. Maybe there is some kind of connection and communication, but it's actually not. It's more. It's a more one-way directive, I guess I would say. And then 3, 4, and 5 is that beginning to actually have an exchange of information. So it might be informing, again, more one way, or there's some consultation. I think consultation is a great step in that kind of process. So it might involve speaking to people about services and their experience in services. But again, it tends to be, if I'm engaging in consultation with people who have lived experience, it's still very much on my terms, and I get to pick and choose what bits of information I decide to take from that consultation. So the power stays with me. And then ideas of placation. So I might invite service users to sit at the table, but essentially, I don't give up power. And I, you know, just to be really truthful, I think I started probably in my work on my process of working with people in the community at level 4 and 5, you know, and thinking, hey, I'm doing some good stuff here, but not realizing how much further I could take that work. And so we go up the ladder and we start to see that partnership, delegation, and citizen control. And this is I guess partnership is the first point where power is really reconsidered, and where we think about how we're working in collaboration with people in the community. And also, you know, delegation, there's this idea, I mean, from Sherry Arnstein's, there's this idea, you know, that there's a clear majority for community control, and then full citizen control being at the top. But on the other side, you know, there's other ways of thinking about it. And I guess, you know, there's all kinds of ladders out there. I was looking because I'm really interested in community development as well. And there's ladders that come out of community development. But this ladder, but this other diagram on the other side comes from Kath Roper, Flip Gray, who are both lived experience researchers, activists. And Emma Cadigan, and there's, you know, you can see that non-consumer-led negotiated spaces of working in partnership, and then that consumer-led. So they're kind of breaking it up into these 3 levels. So I guess there's so many different ways you can break it up. And then I kind of got frustrated with some of these ladders, as Holly knows, and so I decided to make my own. Because I don't know if the world needs one more ladder, but here it is. Here it is. And I think what I wanted here, the purpose of this was, I wanted firstly to include the fact that there was complete exclusion. There are spaces where people are not even, there's not actually any relationship at all. But also I wanted to kind of create one that actually really helped me to understand it in a research context, because as researchers, there is the possibility of doing quite coercive research where people don't know that even necessarily that they're being researched, or there's experimentation. But what is more common in research is that people are subjects of research, or we talk about subjects or participants. And even though there's a bit of an argument in qualitative research that participants are co-constructors of the interaction, if we're doing interviews, it's still very much that the researcher maintains control of what is asked and the design of the whole study. So there's, you know, if we move up in terms of research, we might move to more consumer consultation around research. Again, that holds the space where if I'm a researcher and I'm asking consumers to consult into a project, I still hold the power about what's spoken about, and what's taken up from those suggestions. And the same with the consumer steering group. So I guess when we get to that real high level, doing with really, that's where we start to see co-design and co-production and consumer-led projects, which we'll talk more about here. But I guess what's important to say here is it's important just to be honest. And there's a lovely resource that was recently quite a fan of, which is Indigo Dare, another amazing lived experience advocate and thinker, writer, and she has recently created this kind of checklist, so we can think about, not that it's just about checklists, but so we can think about where are we actually at. And I think what's important here is she actually is able to sort of really get you to think about what else might be possible by reviewing that checklist. Yeah, so I think that's what I have to say about that. Yeah.
Okay, I have another question for you. What is up with the terminology? Like, we hear co-production, co-design used sometimes differently, sometimes interchangeably. Is there some goss about the backstory on that?
Yeah, I think it's I'm going to put this picture up because it might help to think for people to listen as we talk, because I think there's a lot of words in this conversation. But yeah, I think it's really confusing at the moment, because co-design is the sort of big buzzword in health services, and it's the way it's defined is often quite hard to tell the difference between co-design and co-production. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. There's also other words. If you go out into the literature, you'll find other words. There's things like co-construction, co-inquiry. Co seems to be often a thing. And so the co obviously pointing to the collaboration. But co-design and co-production do have different histories and influences. And I do think that's important. And I guess that's why we do keep pointing back to co-production, even though we recognize that co-design is somewhat convergent with it. So I think what's important to me, actually, and part of the conversation that we've had, Holly and I have had quite a bit, is that co-production really comes out of the work of civil rights and social care movements. And Eleanor Ostrom was one of the first people to conceptualize co-production, and she was a professor of political science and actually won the 2009 Nobel Prize in economic science. And her work really shows that involvement of citizens in service development led to actual sustainable and equitable services. And that was the beginning of that thinking in that way, although I also recognize that community development has some of these similar ideas in it too. So you've got, these different places talking to each other. But then Edgar Kahn, who was a civil rights law professor, introduced a notion of social justice into co-production, and really conceptualizing that as this process is about creating a just society. It's not just about doing things or having outcomes. It's actually, in and of itself, is about justice. And then co-design has really different origin story, I suppose. It came out of Scandinavian work and product improvement approach that was really situated in production. And it has increasingly incorporated notions of justice and power sharing. But it is defined in the sense that what's the difference? Sometimes I find by the definitions I read hard to tell, but I guess the working definition I have in my mind is that co-design may or may not involve consumers in some way, in all aspects of it, whereas co-production incorporates co-design, but actually includes the intention is to include people from the beginning, not to include, but to work with people from the beginning to the end of a project, and then which may also be cyclical, and a kind of never-ending circle of projects, really. So yeah, I guess I would say, despite those differing histories, And I do think they're talking to each other, these ideas of co-design and co-production, and they're definitely impacting on each other. But I do think the histories lead to, I guess, reflection on different kinds of commitments to the work. So if I'm thinking from a co-production framework, I'm really having to think about social justice, as well as about the action of trying to do things to create outcomes that might be useful for people, service users. I'm hopefully thinking about both of those things. Yeah, so that's and again, if I go back to Indigo Daya's thing, checklist, there's some beautiful ways that she discerns the difference between those two things, actually. So we've got a link to this at the end of the talk. Yeah.
I think that really helps step me through it. Thinking also a bit about co-production, I'm curious about the elements, and also getting you to unpack a bit about why do it.
Why do it? Yeah. Yeah, I love this diagram. I really love. Again, it's Kath Roper and Flick Gray. If people don't know, Kath Roper is a consumer academic at Melbourne University. I think this is it. You know, these all diagrams can only take us so far, of course, because the process is never going to look this neat. It's always going to be a little bit messier than this. But I guess what's important in this diagram is it shows us that there are some elements that we need to consider when we're thinking about co-production. It doesn't tell us how to do it, but it tells us that, you know, there's a co-planning phase there. That's important, right? So it's not just about, hey, I've got an idea, I'll go to a community and then we'll work out how to do my idea. It's about, what about if I go to the community and work out, say, hey, what is important here to solve? Who needs to be involved here? What should we do? What should we be doing? What's important for us to think about before we start to think about how we're going to do that and what we're going to do? But then even that thinking is done together. And then as we go into the phase of doing that work, how do we actually do that together? Who's important to be there doing that? It might not be always the best thing that the conventional researcher is out there asking those questions. It might not be as useful to the community, or to answering a question or to implementing something. And then co-evaluation, I guess that for me is about reflecting on what it is we've done. How useful was that? Did we get anywhere? And that might take us back to co-planning again, thinking around that circle. And co-evaluation, of course, can be formalized as a research. But even if I'm formalizing it as research, well, what is it that I want to ask? What is it I want to do or think about here? It's not just about me deciding that and predetermining that. So it's constantly working with community members to move around that. And then your other question, why do it? Well, I mean, the real conventional response, and it's all there in the literature and incredibly important, is that it could improve the relevance of research priorities, outcomes from the research. It could increase service user participation in research. Also can raise the quality of interpretation and translation of research. Those are kind of like, you know, those formal things we need to think about as researchers. But personally, I think there's other reasons. And I do think, you know, there's something not just valuable, but also wonderful and enriching about working with each other. And you know, my relationship of working with Holly is, for me, just a really important connection in my life. And I do believe that working together, we increase each other's capacity to do this kind of work. And also, you know, I guess the call to justice is important to me too. You know, nothing about us without us is a term that we all hear, which came from, you know, disabilities movements, but also is used in consumer survivor ex-patient movements. And it's not just, we make it a meaningless slogan unless we do something about that, unless we act upon that. And that actually means that the work is about doing justice. Yeah, I think it is. I'm going to put that one back to you, Holly. So why do you get involved in what's in it for you? Yeah.
I guess I think I came to research to try to make the case for doing things in a radically different way in mental health services in particular to address iatrogenic harm. And I started working on a project with yourself and some of our other colleagues using co-production methodologies to research peer work and open dialogue. And then I became involved in a number of other projects trying to negotiate how these could most meaningfully incorporate people with lived experience and draw on the growing body of thought from the consumer survivor ex-patient movement. So yeah, I guess I was thinking about how once our emotions and behaviours exist outside of a narrowly defined normal, we're often subject to saneness discrimination and psychiatric coercion. And so I'm in this line of work to change that. And it still feels very uncomfortable for me to talk publicly about my experiences, particularly as an AOD service user. And I think that my own internalised stigma is proof that we need more and more lived experience perspectives to challenge these powerful social taboos. So yeah, I guess I could say that that's what's in it for me, a chance to dispute and disprove saneism, stigma and discrimination, and interrupt that discourse that compulsive drug use is due to brain disease or moral failing, both in what we research, but also in how we research and who we do it with.
So the process as well as the actual work of what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could, I mean, some of the things you're speaking to are really point to some of the core principles and values, but I'm wondering if of co-production, but I'm wondering if you can talk more about that. And I know
Yeah.
slides, I put it up.
I think for number one, thinking about the idea of consumers as partners from the outset, it makes me think about how the further along the path we go, the harder it is to turn back and set a new path. And, I prefer to have that conversation purposefully when we're at the start of the journey with all the various paths ahead of us. And I get frustrated if you ask me about which path to take when we're already like 6 hours or 6 months down the track, because it doesn't feel like what I have to say is going to meaningfully affect the outcome. So the right from the start thing is a key principle. I think it's necessary to acknowledge and explore and address power differentials because there's often a massive asymmetry between the power of people who use services, mental health services, drug and alcohol services, and the people who work in them. And the Mental Health Act is a big part of this. I have the right to refuse treatment or make alternative treatment choices if my health issues are cancer or diabetes, but not if they're suicide or mania or psychosis. So I'm quoting Indigo Daya again here, and we've referenced her at the end of our slides. She says, people want to have a say about the things that affect their lives. The bigger the impact, the more say we want. And if a service or system has the power to take away our human rights, if it can hurt us, then we should be the ones whose voices matter most. So I think that really, she nails it there. On 3, I think building opportunities for consumer leadership is essential because we're not passive recipients of care. We're holders of wisdom and knowledge, and holders of wisdom and knowledge that no one else has, and holders of knowledge and wisdom in a system that many people experience to be broken, that drastically needs to be different in order that people can have better lives and we can challenge injustice. So that wisdom and knowledge is really important to harness. And I think that people with lived experience are the ones who can, A, provide it, but also B, provide advice about how to best facilitate access to it. And so on 4, I'm thinking about needing to embrace a different perspective and a new idea that is necessarily disruptive. Despite the efforts of many kind and committed health professionals, things are in a bad way. If we keep doing things the way we have been, I feel like we can't expect different outcomes, and I feel like we're all pretty hungry for different outcomes. So yeah, that's how I make sense of those principles and the values that underpin them.
Yeah, I think I'm just wondering, thinking about that, for you, what does it look like in practice? And if there's a project you're involved in, I guess, enact those principles and values.
Yeah, well, maybe most recently I've become involved in a project called the Rainbow Embassy, which I know you're also a wonderful part of. And so in that research team, we're looking into trauma-informed care for members of the LGBTIQA+ community, and what would that look like, investigating that. And I feel like it teeters between consumer-led and co-produced, and it was really initiated by a discussion between myself and another colleague, both lived experience folks, segued into a conversation and a project to write a discussion paper with a colleague who's an expert by education. So we started to bring in some different types of knowledge, the first person embodied ways of knowing, and the what does the literature say about this ways of knowing, and start to try to mash them up together. And then that kind of project was already kind of in its embryonic co-planning stages when we had an opportunity to form a research team as part of Raising the Bar. So I feel like that's interesting, because that co-planning phase on the beautiful diagram is the one I find most elusive and most frustrating. You know, like later when we speak about the challenges, I think that's one of the challenges that comes up for me, is that if you involve people meaningfully from the start, you're often doing so before a project's funded and asking folks, particularly people with lived experience, to work in an unremunerated way. But then if you don't, then you miss that incredibly fertile stage of generative discussion where the project takes shape. So I think that's what's beautiful about the Rainbow Embassy project for me, is that it's able to really explore some of the potential of that co-planning phase, which other projects, when I've come on board after they've been developed, after they've been funded, in order to get the funding, it's necessarily been shaped somewhat before I'm at the party. Yeah.
It makes me think, there's this idea that we know it's co-production or consumer-led, or when we all agree that it's that. And I'm just wondering, how do you know that?
Yeah, this is a hard to explain thing, I guess, a vibe. Like you'll see on the checklist, you can kind of look at some measurables about, how many people of which side of the false binary of lived experience, non-lived experience, and pay rates, and there are some metrics, but I do feel like there's the vibe that it's quite a relational way of working, right? So you can discern it through the kind of feelings about the relationships.
And that makes me think with the relationships, and I think you've got it on your slide here, is these power differentials that happened. I'm wondering what is the significance of power in co-production?
Well, I think like for me, I'm in co-production to try to challenge some of saneism and stigma around drug use, and health services have had a lot of power asymmetry. So I think power is fundamental to what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I'd love to read the Mary O'Hagan quote: Power is an uneven and invisible resource like oxygen. Often people only notice power when they don't have it. They are like people exiled to the mountaintops who gasp because they don't have enough oxygen, while privileged people at sea level breathe so comfortably they never have to think about a supply of oxygen. So I think I've been coming off on the receiving end of power asymmetry, found that experience challenging, feel like it's fundamental to this experience of work, and feel like, you're acutely aware of power asymmetry when you're on the receiving end of it.
Yeah.
So how about you? What do you think about the significance of power in co-production?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, just straight up, just to acknowledge, I agree. I think there's a big power differential, and there's no skirting that, and we shouldn't skirt that. It's not that I always feel particularly powerful in working in an institution where there's often other systems of power that I'm kind of answerable to. So funders, university hierarchies, regulations, ethics committees, editors, journals, all of those things. But I guess where I notice that because I have the privilege in a sense to look outwards rather than feeling the pressures of the power differentials, within a particular team if I'm working in co-production. So you know, like Mary O'Hagan says, when I'm in that team, I just don't notice that, you know. So it's, I guess in that sense, I have to be really quite deliberate about noticing and thinking, am I listening? Have I listened enough? What was that person saying? Because I think when we hold power, and, you know, in terms of my power is linked to me by the institution that I work in the titles that, you know, you're given within a particular institution. So it's a kind of social power, if you like. And so it's really incumbent on me to kind of keep thinking, is people maybe being polite to me, saying something politely, but actually asking me to do something, to think about something. So how do I keep checking in around that? Also, you know, I have educational privilege, so maybe things that I understand, not just about the institution, but about research that I take for granted, and I'm not thinking about what that might mean for other people. And I think very importantly, and you've pointed to this, you know, is that it's also the systemic stigma and discrimination towards people with lived experience that maintains my privilege and position as well. So how do we talk about that? How do we start to be deliberate and make that visible? And I'm talking about things like, you know, the saneism, ableism, racism, war on drugs, you know, all the stuff that led people to discount perspectives of those people with lived experience. And that needs addressing and reflecting upon. I think what's really important is the power that you're afforded as as an academic, or if you hold a position in a health service as a clinician or something like that, and you're doing research. I think we can't make that up for debate. We have to know that that's there. It's not, we can't play power blind, or, you know, we're all equal here and everything's okay, because that's actually, you know, gaslighting for people. So that's not the bit, and sitting there and feeling really guilty and bad about that is also not useful. You know, I've got in my mind something Brett said to us yesterday, which was that, you know, power isn't always bad. So how can we think about power to be used not as an oppressive force, but also to be used as a resource to support collaboration, and maybe even, you know, and constantly to be promoting lived experience voices and to step back. Yeah, so, and also to be open to the fact that we might actually stuff up and get that wrong, and we may disappoint. So how can I have those conversations even if I'm disappointing people?
Yeah. So it might involve explicit conversations about power. How do you think we can have them?
Yeah, so just skip this one slide. Takes time. How is power experienced by everyone? But I think I think we can have explicit conversations. This is an exercise that was put together by Kath Roper. Again, we're big fans. Like, what can I say?
We've got mentionitis.
We've got a link to this at the end. It really is. It's beautiful because they have, I guess, brought it down to some of the simple and important elements of it. So it's not such a sort of, I guess, a knowledge that is out of reach for you know, you can pick this up and you can start to do co-production, co-design. So this is just one way of having that purposeful conversation. It's a kind of map of how you might do it. But what's important really is the purposefulness of the conversation about power. So thinking about, you know, what does power look like in our particular team? Who has more, less, and why? How can we shift that? How can we mitigate that? How can we work with that? How can we speak about the stuff when it gets really hard to speak about? How can we invite people to speak about that stuff as well? So it's not just about asking other people to have that courageous conversation with you, or you having to have that conversation always with someone else, but also about, hey, you know what, I'm just beginning to notice, you know, that maybe you've raised a couple of times this issue, and we still haven't really spoken about that, and I'm just wondering what's important to speak around that. Yeah, because people are in different positions, and that's related to not just their maybe participation directly in that team and their role in that team, but also about the broader social political context. So, you know, if that person I'm just thinking, we're working in our Rainbow Embassy with, I guess, thinking more about decolonizing names, and that's because one of the people in our team also is an Indigenous person, so that's important to us for thinking and to our thinking, and constantly having to check in and check ourselves, because actually, we'll start doing things in a white way without reflecting on that. Yeah, so I don't know, there's a lot of answer there, sorry.
No, never say sorry for a whole lot of answer. How about we get into some of the challenges?
Yeah, and I think it's important that we do get into that, because we don't want to say, oh, there's this big shiny thing called co-design.
Yeah.
Hey,
try it, you'll like it.
It is challenging. Maybe I'd like to say for all the right reasons as well. It's challenging because we are going to be looking at power differentials, and are going to question ourselves when we silence disruptive voices. And how do we change that game? How do we challenge the status quo? How do we challenge the way of doing things, business as usual, so that we actually change things? Because if we're not challenging things, we can't change things. And how do we create, and I do really think as well, because we're talking about power, because we're talking about relationships, and we're talking about processes that we're, I guess, are aspiring to trusting relationships, not necessarily as a destination, but just as an aspiration. How do we make those relationships meaningful, and how do we keep that central to the work? It's not an add-on, it's not an extra, it is the work. It is the process itself of doing co-design and co-production. It is an outcome. It is what we were hoping for, which is nothing about us without us. And we may have also, we may have different values driving our work. So how do we talk about those values and find places where, the work is meaningful for everybody? Also, I guess the idea of building capacity, sort of being mindful. I mean, I notice my capacity is built enormously by the work that I do with the lived experience folks in our teams. But, how am I reciprocating? How am I supporting? I guess that's the horizontal within team stuff that's challenging. There's constant conversations and negotiations and thinking, and not pushing, not driving fast just because I might have a funder that's got a 1-year framework. Well, what else do I need to think about here? Because that's one thing that's there. That's an external pressure, if you like. So I think sometimes the external, or in community development, they talk about the vertical influences, the funding bodies, all the hierarchies, the regulations, pay structures, ethics committees. They can put pressure on me, which then I could put onto the team, and because if I'm in a power position, that could become really problematic. So how do we manage both of those tensions? How do we have conversations about those tensions as well?
And the worries that those tensions bring up.
Lots of worries, of course. And the world of the funding bodies may not match the world of doing co-production and co-design in a slow, deliberate and thoughtful way.
Working at 3 speeds at once.
And then some days it looks like, oh my God, I can't do this today, it's too hard. And some days it's like the best thing you've ever done. So I don't think it is neither one nor the other. So I guess if I don't know what else I want to say about that. Maybe I could ask you a question, Holly. I know that you've got a slide here too, so I might pop up your slide. So what are some of the challenges of co-production as you see them?
Well, similarly to you, I think I found it cathartic when I read that article by Schultz. There's just no flexibility, how space and time impact mental health consumer research, because I do really think that the material conditions of co-production, like scarce time and scarce money, are really deeply in tension with the practices that are about prioritising relationships over outcomes as a way to get really superior outcomes. And this idea, this phrase that we've been loving recently, move at the speed of trust. I think sometimes, particularly when we're trying to heal, you know, century old divisions and, you know, really big hurts, the speed of trust can be slow, and needing to move at the speed of trust, and maybe the speed of the trust of the person with the least trust, that might be slow going. And so timeframes are really jamming us up to move fast, and co-productions really, you know, calling to us to try to prioritize the relationship. And I feel it's not impossible to navigate the tension, but again, just always be narrating ABN. I'm always thinking about how can we narrate the tensions, and how do we, can we be honest about the worries that it brings up for us, so that we don't end up trying to control each other, or trying to control the project to meet our need to have less worries. So yeah, thinking about the co-planning catch-22, as I flagged earlier, is a source of consternation for me. And resourcing issues, you know, we're trying to combat epistemic injustice, the history of types of knowledge being devalued, but we're trying to do that when we've been socialised with those ways of knowledge in systems that still perpetuate those ways of knowledge. So, you know, it's challenging. I want to practice when I'm thinking about advertising for a role and looking at people's resumes. I want to be thinking about valuing lived experience, the expertise, not just research training or hierarchies or degrees, because I feel worried that sometimes people with lived experience just have to have both, right? They have to have the conventionally well-regarded ways of knowledge plus the, you know, stigmatized mad ways of knowledge or drug-taking ways of knowledge. But actually, I think that it's the stigmatized forms of knowledge that have historically been devalued that we want to try to start to pay attention to and appreciate and make space for, rather than just like trying to, you know, sprinkle that on top. Yeah. So that's what comes up for me, that old chestnut of epistemic injustice.
And I think some of the things you're talking about as well are really about it's sort of, I guess, inherently disruptive, that kind of work, because it is pushing back against sort of ways of knowing. And I guess, how do people make space to hear that? I thought that was...
I think some people will and some people won't, but I do think we have plenty of strong allies, and even more people who have the potential to be allies in this pursuit of nothing about us without us. And I think most, you know, like, because I'm a service user, but I'm also a person who works in the system, and I think most of us working in the system will know that people experience the system as broken. And I think the current system is not working for clinicians or health professionals or helping professionals in a lot of ways either. Like, I think we see really troubling rates of moral injury among health and helping professionals. And so I think we, you know, in some ways we all have skin in the game.
What about this idea of tolerating uncertainty? I've seen that on here, which is, you know, a beautiful term that also comes out of open dialogue. Yeah,
I think, yeah, that kind of theme has run throughout some of the different types of work that you and I have done together. And I feel like it's, yeah, super challenging to me and super intriguing, this idea of how can we tolerate uncertainty and be with not knowing and be up for the shades of grey and try to stay in the coexisting truths, that two people can have seemingly conflicting truths that can coexist. Yeah, I don't know, is there more to say about that?
No, I like what you're saying. I guess I'm wondering about commenting on recognition of contribution and yeah, and what else do we need in place to support people with lived experience? From your perspective, yeah.
Well, so before I came to this line of work, I was a union organiser, and so I know a bit about industrial relations, and I'm really curious about the reasonable adjustments idea. So if you've been given a psychiatric diagnosis, that counts as a psychosocial disability. We have an Anti-Discrimination Act that says you have a right to reasonable adjustments to access the workplace. And so if we were thinking about that in terms of a person in a wheelchair, that would be a ramp. So what's our metaphorical ramp for people with big feelings or psychosocial disability or mental distress? What will help me take my big feelings to work? What will help me be able to stay at work when I'm experiencing big feelings and fearing their social consequence, right? Because I think it's a bit about mental distress, but it's also a bit about its social consequences and thinking about the social model of disability. So yeah, I'm a person who experiences fluctuating capacity. I've needed to find, non-shaming words to speak about that with myself and others, thinking about what will help me under the heading of reasonable adjustments, negotiating that with colleagues and team leaders. So I think that reasonable adjustments is particularly interesting to me as a place we can start to support people with lived experience, because we do, like I say, already have an Anti-Discrimination Act. And shout outs to the Mad Workplace Guide by Flick Gray and Marinda Epstein on the Our Consumer Place website, which is a beautiful resource that talks about reasonable adjustments. But I think it comes all part and parcel with courageous conversations, because, we can't get what we don't ask for, or all these things, even though we have some rights in a piece of legislation, they don't kind of enact themselves. We got to negotiate them. So yeah, I think interpersonally, then thinking more about interpersonally makes me think about making generous assumptions. And then also, I guess the reason we started talking about lexicon and language right at the start is because I think the words we use matter. And I think myself, times where I've been feeling really freaked out and have not a lot of trust in my interactions with academics or health professionals, the words they've used have really given me clues about the worldview that we're coming from and how we can try to make some connection there. So yeah, thinking about what's the most welcoming, inclusive and person-centered language you can use, thinking about what ramps you could, metaphorical and literal ramps you could build into your projects and workplaces. And then thinking about the material conditions, paid participation guides, making sure that you get people in the room together, you get equal numbers of people in the room together, and you pay them the same amount of money. And yeah, that you're up for hearing about difficult conversations. So I guess that's the welcoming big feelings. Or I liked in the Beyond Sticky Notes, they talk about the mindset of hospitality, and I think that's about welcoming difficult conversations and really saying thank you to people when they raise things that feel hard to speak about. So what do you think about how people could get started?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all those institutional things you're talking about, the institutional supports. How do we make sure that there's that groundwork, proper pay and all those things? And I do think that is work that needs to be thought through beforehand, and might be about having for conventional research as well as about having courageous conversations with different organizations and managers and all those things. So there's that stuff, which is, I think, sort of lays a potential foundation for doing that work. But I've put this together yesterday, so this is hopefully it works. So yeah, I guess I would just say to people, get started, but but hold the contradiction, don't rush, because go make contact with people, not in a kind of demanding way, but tell me about all the problems here, but maybe so much as actually just connecting with people who are already expressing issues and problems that are happening for them in a particular service or situation or community based situation. It doesn't have to be within a service. And what's important to people, what matters, that's that co-thinking, that beginning, that co-thinking space. But the relationship is really central, so not rushing, because I think co-design and co-production just require us to think about how are we actually working together, Nothing about us without us is also a call to thinking about relational practice in research. So again, the idea that the process, that once we're in that process, that is the outcome. So we might have secondary outcomes from our work. Wonderful, you know, we'll get these other things like research knowledge and publications and you know, and recognized contribution in those publications. But the essential is the fact that by doing that, we're doing something different and we're doing something radical. And not, hopefully not, it will become less and less radical, but it is that radical shift from working, doing to, or doing for, to doing with. And also, I guess really thinking about diversity and disruption. You know, who is it important to work with? We can't just go straight to the people we love, although, you know, like the most, although that, of course, we will do that too. But you know, who is it can speak to a particular experience or topic? What is it important that they can, what's that person, maybe kinds of experiences that they might have had that would support the thinking around this. Also diversity around gender, you know, race, social class, so that we get that intersectional analysis of what's actually happening here. Because a person, a woman of colour's experience in a mental health services may be very, very different to a middle class white woman's experience. So we need to understand those differences, and also more recent experiences, as well as experiences that may be way back. So the person maybe has recently had an experience of what it was like to be on that particular ward that you want to have a look at and look at the practices there, because people keep telling you that it's not good or needs improving. But also, I think really importantly is, you know, working also with people who have expertise. Like I think of like this idea of lived expertise, where people are really connected to the knowledges of consumer survivor ex-patient movements, or, you know, the ideas about the war on drugs and how that's implicated in stigma towards people with alcohol and drug dependence. So, you know, really, I guess that brings in that a critical framework and sort of situates a thinking of lived experience. But also then I would say, you know, get going with it and practice. Don't aim for perfection, but be honest, be where you are. You can scale up as you go, but just like if it's consultation, that's great. Just know that it is. But maybe aspire. Don't just settle for consultation. That if you start to do consultation, you might be able to go further. And if you start to go further and you start to working with people, don't skip the power conversation. It's a conversation that's really important and understandably difficult to have, inherently uncomfortable, but important, because it enables people with lived experience to contribute in a different way. I think, I mean, maybe you can comment on that, Holly, but I'll just say just one other thought, just the pragmatics. You know, how are you going to share information? Has the person got access to email, to internet? Where are you going to hold the meetings? Is it a good idea to hold a meeting in a service where people have had bad experiences? Or maybe you might want to think about doing that in the community. How are you going to communicate? What are people's roles and responsibilities? And that's got to be fair and realistic. If you're only paying people for a 3-hour meeting and you give them 1 hour reading beforehand, well then you need to factor in your, you know, a 1 hour reading. Yeah, I guess, yeah. So whose role and responsibility? Who's going to chair the meeting? Is, you know, and how do we mix that up so that you know, we're considering power in that situation? Yeah, and fair pay, which I think you've spoken to, Holly. You know, I think it's really critical. We can't, you know, asking people to do things as volunteers is really problematic, because I'm not working as a volunteer in my work, and it really matters to me that I can, you know, pay my rent and pay my shopping bills and my utility bills. Yeah. What I'm just wondering about, what are your thoughts on that, where people might start?
Yeah, I think you've really nailed it there. I also noticed some of the questions that we've been getting speak to some of the nuances of getting started. So I wonder if it's helpful to talk more about it when we're looking at the questions.
Okay, yeah. Well, then maybe I'll just pop up these resources, which getting started some resources, I think.
Yeah, what a good love language. Give people some stuff to read and scheme on.
Yeah, and we didn't want to overload. There's heaps and heaps out there, but these are some beautiful ones. And I think, you know, there's a favouring for us of resources that are created by people with lived experience. But also there's some beautiful work, Horner's work on co-constructing research, which is a lovely review of the literature around that.
And all out from behind the paywall, because we want to give you resources that are accessible.
Yeah, they're not hidden behind the university paywalls. And then there's a book I think you mentioned earlier, Holly, the Beyond Sticky Notes, which is a book that was actually written by someone here in Sydney. And yeah, it's just, yeah, really practical, useful tips throughout the book. Yeah. So let me just go, I think this is our final slide, and this is where we can go to questions maybe. We've also put our emails up there in case people want to email us with a question.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll do acknowledgements just at the end. So the questions, how do we open those? Aha, there they are.
Yeah, so there's some questions in the chat and some in the Q&A. Which one do you want to start with?
I don't mind, whichever. I can't see them for some reason, so maybe you can read them off.
Okay. Is it tokenism if the individual wants to contribute in a consulting fashion, if it is intended to be meaningful consultation? No, I think we're saying it's worse to say you're doing co-production when you're doing consultation. I think my hot take is if you're doing consultation, say you're doing consultation, you know, if I call you in to talk about what's your hopes and dreams for a transport strategy, but I'm offering you a choice of orange car, blue car or red car, then, you know, you've kind of oversold and underdelivered. But if you say, hey, do you want to come and talk about your preferences between red car, blue car and orange car, then I know what I'm coming to, or what I can decide if I'm up for that or not. Anything else to say about that, Jo?
No, I think that's it. I think it's really important, even though it's kind of positioned as a hierarchy. What we're really talking about here is looking at what's possible, where to go if you want to go further.
Yeah.
And hopefully people do, but also just being really honest about where you actually are. And meaningful consultation is important. Consultation can be, you know, can also be a very radical step, and particularly if that the information from the consultation is taken seriously and taken on board. Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody says, what systemic injustice are you looking at? I wonder if that was when I said epistemic injustice, and I can, Jo, can you remind me what's the author to give that person a clue? Is it Fricker?
Yes, Amanda Fricker. There's a great book actually, which I have here. Put it up. There's a great book on epistemic injustice, and I guess it's just about how particular groups of people, particularly people who've experienced stigma in the community, are more likely to be doubted as knowers of their own truths and realities. And that knowing can conflict with kind of dominant ways of knowing, but really be very subjugated, pushed down, and because there isn't a language around that knowing, it can become very hard for people because they may not have access to I guess research studies that speak from those places, and it comes out of, I think it comes out of like there wasn't a language at one point for sexual harassment in the workplace. I think that's the example that Miranda Fricker uses, and because of that, people would have these horrible experiences and really uncomfortable feelings, but there was no way of saying it was sexual harassment. It was this awful thing, and so that language and that knowledge and that way of being able to talk about that actually. I guess it gives people the power to actually shift what actually happens about those things. It's not just about the speaking of those things, it's about the doing something about those things. Yeah.
So I'm going to keep zooming through because I'm feeling worried about time, but somebody is asking us if an organisation's efforts to co-design or co-plan are fledgling and maybe time constrained, is it better to have some lived experience involvement and make mistakes rather than avoid it?
What do you think?
I think probably for me, my bottom lines are, am I paying people? Am I meaningfully involving people? Am I giving them enough time? Am I setting them up to succeed? Like, do they have enough time to do the job? So I think that's probably, you know, if I felt like those things weren't possible, then I'd say, okay, wait, maybe I'll hold off and try to gather those resources. But yeah, I do reckon that we're going to make mistakes the whole way through, even if we think we're perfectly prepared to nail it. So yeah, I like Joe's advice about get started, but go slowly and be up for talking about learning together.
Yeah, and also, you know, maybe dream about what else might be possible with the funders. Is it possible to go back? I mean, we've had a project once that was, you know, going a little over time for all the right reasons, not for the wrong reasons, because we were, you know, doing it deliberately and thoughtfully. So we did go back to the funders and have that conversation, and actually people were very supportive of that. Not that I'm not going to set you up for that always to be supportive conversation, but it, you know, what other kinds of conversations can we have? I mean, I go and have conversations with ethics committees as well, you know, because the ethics committees frameworks which come from biomedicine can sometimes be a bit, you know, risk averse, let's say.
Yeah, I think sometimes people ask for lived experience roles on a board or a committee that already exists. So you could shift resources from something where it isn't an identified lived experience to one where it is. And then that might help kind of get some runs on the board and make a case for the value proposition of actually a way, you know, set some money in the budget for a salary for some lived experience workers. So yeah, there's some kind of strategies around building, increasing amounts or starting where you're at and building. Somebody also asked us, what is fair pay? They say they do have a paid participation policy with payment, but it can't match public sector salaries. I guess I like the National Mental Health Commission paid participation policy, and so I've used that. It's on their website wherever I've needed to kind of reference a policy or establish a benchmark. And when I'm on a committee as a drug and alcohol service user, I get paid the same amount as the people on that committee who are there, who are doctors or pharmacists, or, you know, anyone who's there who's not there in their paid time, which I guess includes the doctors if they're not doing their billable business. And so, yeah, I think that kind of paid participation policy where lived expertise is remunerated at the same rate as expertise by education, that's what really nails it, I reckon. Somebody says, I often find lack of budget as a legitimate reason not to pay consumer participants in co-design work. I couldn't justify and request consumers to participate. I struggle with this a lot lately. Any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, the budgeting is, you know, that's again, we're looking at systemic problems here. You know, the idea that, oh, you know, we can't budget for that, and yet we're talking about, you know, service development stuff that is actually essential for meeting the needs of the people using those services. So yeah, I mean, I think it's not something we can, you know, it's not just the work of an individual. You know, we can't take all of that work on ourselves, but I do think these are the places where maybe we could start to form connections and coalitions and work together to challenge systems where people are not, you know, prioritizing payment for people with lived experience. Yeah, so I agree. I think it is a struggle, and I have done work where people are unpaid, and that's, you know, voluntary on their part. But I don't feel very comfortable. I don't feel comfortable with that because, yeah, for all, you know, all the reasons we've talked about, and, you know, people with lived experience, you know, are then left to not only contribute to the work, but, you know, in an unpaid way, but then to try and actually make up hours in paid work, I think.
Yeah, I guess I wonder about, is there any scope to pitch it as a QI project or put in for some funding for some kind of a one-off project? I wonder if we make it a different than business as usual thing, is it an excuse to do things differently or source funding externally, or is there a way that kind of breaks the impasse around the funding scarcity? I'm going to keep zooming us through some other questions. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on where therapy fits in. If we take that ladder, therapy sits near the bottom. we see a lot of co-production work in developing therapy or service models. How do we keep those co-production principles front of mind and meaningfully enacted in the therapies that are developed and delivered? Jo, hot takes?
Oh, I like the question. I don't know that I have an answer. I think the question is part of beginning to answer that, really, because maybe that's worth doing, work to be done in a co-production framework, to think about. I was talking to someone recently, and we were talking about, what would it be to do research, qualitative research in trauma-informed ways? And we were like, that's a really, really good question. And the question came from a person with lived experience who saw that problem, and the solution isn't necessarily just right there. So yeah, maybe that's a question. What does it mean when you start to co-produce and think about therapies collectively with people with lived experience? What does it start to look like? Maybe it will start to look like something different.
Yeah, I guess I struggle with this in my peer practice, right? Because I'm trying to answer the call of this consumer survivor ex-patient movement, nothing about us without us, but I'm working in a public mental health system where there's a lot of note-taking about people in their absence and a lot of conversations at handover or multidisciplinary team meetings about a person in their absence. And I think for that reason, that's why open dialogue is so popular among the consumer survivor ex-patient movement, as like a gold egg, just to say, like, it is possible that mental health systems can be structured so that care planning happens in conversations with people, so that documentation supports that and is provided to them, and that there is much less of this about us without us. So yeah, I guess I would point to practices like co-created notes to try to, and shifting care planning from in a person's absence to with a person, as ways to try to challenge that aspect of, maybe therapy wouldn't be so low down on the ladder of engagement if we tried to use some of these new kind of critical perspectives.
Yeah, and I guess there are some therapies where people are reaching for that at the moment, things like open dialogue and narrative ways of working, where it's sort of more dialogical, relational approach. Yeah.
Someone says, how can we challenge the vertical pressures in terms of funding limitations or timeframes? Are funding bodies receptive to the need for more money / more time? How do we push for change in this space?
Yeah, I think we spoke a little bit about that when, with our team thing, where we went back to a funder. Yeah, sometimes not. And sometimes I think it's a systemic issue again, and we need to kind of think more, how are we going to do this collectively? How are we going to go to organise, things like the ARC or HMRC, and sort of have these conversations about, we need money for the co-planning part, not just once it's started. And we also, we need to think about the fact that the timeline might not work out exactly, or that the project may change somewhat once we engage properly with communities.
Yeah, I haven't done this yet, but it might be interesting to try to speak to some of these challenges in a grant application. Like, could we write about epistemic injustice? Could we write about reasonable adjustments? Could we try to say, hey, we want to run this project and we want to take this much more generous amount of time, and we are asking for this much more generous amount of money for these very good reasons as per literature. I don't know, maybe we would get knocked back, but maybe we'd get a chance to try to show that these ways of working require different ways of funding and different timelines. So yeah, I guess keep pushing. How do we push for change in this space? Keep it up.
Yeah, I think it's maybe just important to say there, though, that we are going to come up against these things, and we might sometimes find workarounds. I think very, very importantly is to have that conversation transparently with the team. I'm finding, if there's a pressure from a funder, I'll come back to our team and say, hey, we're going to, there's this particular pressure. I'm getting quite anxious about this. I'm wondering how we navigate that, because it's not always, I can't resolve, we can't resolve everything by changing the funding body. So, what else can we do here? What can we do with what we've got? What would be acceptable to do? Yeah.
So another question about, I also wonder, this is, someone says, I'm not sure what they were wondering about, doing a PhD and lived experience participation has not even been discussed, yet people with lived experience are the subjects in my research. You've given me so much to think about in addressing this in the first steps of design. So I think maybe our co-production collective Motley Crew is going to need to spin off a workshop about lived experience perspectives in PhDs, because I know you and Kath have been talking about that a bunch.
Yeah, I think you know, there are some people doing that, and I know that Kath Roper in Melbourne is supervising a PhD, I think, with Brett Scholes around, which is a co-production one. There are co-production PhDs, co-design PhDs. So
one of our research teams in Raising the Bar is trying to do just that. So yeah, bit of solidarity, and maybe coming at you soon with some resources for some folks thinking out aloud about that. Someone else says, any tips on doing lived experience and co-design well, where the people with a lived experience are not currently connected to services or are not known to us, and perhaps distrust services because of past trauma? Yeah, hard relate with that question. What do you reckon, Jo?
Yeah, I guess this is where as well, you know, if you have connections to community, this is the place. I mean, it might not, you know, just going directly to the person or, you know, it might not work. So who does have connections to those communities? Who is trusted?
Yeah, I'd say if you have some money, hire someone who's from that community, who has experienced those distrusting feelings and who still is, you know, powerfully and deeply involved with that community of folks who are still on the receiving end of reasons to distrust, and they'll be able to work with you and tell you. You know, that's really that when we talk about lived expertise, or a person bringing their expertise, we're asking them to bring their networks and their social capital, and they can tell us these things about, what do the people who do distrust say about what it would take for them to trust?
Yeah.
So last but not least, do you find you get lots of roadblocks from within universities and research organisations themselves, especially in making reasonable adjustments? I just started working with vulnerable populations. This has been a big problem already. So I was wondering about your experience. Do you know a good way to approach this problem? Yeah, I think I would say that because this idea of fluctuating capacity is at odds with the ideal worker culture and, you know, kind of dominant ideas in managerialism, that already, you know, workers even who might not have a psychosocial disability, you know, feel big challenges in the workplace about getting everything done on the smell of an oily rag and have it done yesterday. And so, yeah, it's quite countercultural to try to talk about doing things slowly, being up for things not getting done as quickly as you planned, being up for extending timelines, being up for people taking time off work or coming to work and not getting as much done. Because, yeah, really, when I say reasonable adjustment, somebody under law, well, what's reasonable is the thing that's the negotiation point, right? But they have the right to anywhere between a little and a lot wiggle room. You know, here's your job. When you're experiencing mental distress, you are able to do some or much less of it in order to continue, and maybe that's the ramp. So yeah, I'd say a good way to approach it is to check out that Mad Workplaces guide that I shared about. It's actually two. One's written for managers, one's written for people with lived experience. It's about 50 pages, so they can go a lot deeper than we can go together now. Anything to add, Jo?
No, I'm just mindful of time, and I'm just guessing I'd like to sort of just say the acknowledgements because I think they're important to say. But I guess really importantly for us, Brett Bellingham, we'd like to acknowledge his contribution to this talk and development and slide development and the amazing conversations that we've had around this. And also obviously for the invitation to speak here today. So, you know, thanks to the Community Mental Health Drug and Alcohol Research Network. Also, I'd like to thank the Mental Health Commission New South Wales for funding the Raising the Bar project, which has, you know, led to a lot of the work that we're currently doing, and also to the collective, the Raising the Bar team and the co-production collective, which includes Brett Bellingham, Kate Gill, Mark Goodhue, Catherine Vidal, and also many of our wonderful team members, who are many to name now. I think we're pushing up to about 20 people working across those teams. So yeah, just like to acknowledge them and the work that they're doing. Yeah. Have you any other thoughts, Holly?
No, love your work, Jo.
Yeah, I love your work too. Well, everyone, we didn't get to see you, which is we'd love to have seen your faces, but really appreciate you turning up today and listening to us ramble on. And there's our emails, so please do feel that you can connect with us. We're always happy to connect and have conversation.
Yeah. Good luck with all the amazing things that you're up to and all the brave-hearted ways that you're trying to move towards co-production.
Yeah, great. Bye for now.